Thank you very much. Welcome to the talk. If you found this session by reading the online program, welcome. If you found it by looking at the printed program, a double welcome, because the printed program only has about a quarter of the abstract. Apparently, new lines can foil us even in 2019, so it was cut off. But making decisions with incomplete information is a very valid and useful skill these days, so congratulations. All right. So I recently turned 35, and at my age, when you have a birthday, you don't really celebrate it as much as reflect on some things that happened earlier in your life. And what I realized during that process was that I have been using the web for about 2/3 of my life. I know this exactly because as a present for my 12th birthday, my parents bought a 28.8 kbit modem. This was back in Poland. And we connected to the internet, to the web from home, from our PC, for the very first time. And that was, we had to call Warsaw. There was only one dial-up line in Poland at the time. It lasted about an hour, and we paid, I think, about $25 for that 1 hour call. That was about 10% of the average monthly wage in Poland. So we didn't do it as much after we found out how much it cost. But my father was and still is a university professor in Poland, so I could use his office and use the web more after that. And it's strange how our memory works. I still remember, I haven't used that dial-up number in 20 years, but I still remember that phone number. And what I also remember was the first website that I visited, that I recall visiting at least. I would have gone to Lycos or Excite. I don't remember the search engine actually, but I remember the band that I was interested in at the time, and this is a Swedish pop band, and it's super embarrassing. It's terrible music. It hasn't aged very well. Neither the name nor the kind of music has aged very well, but for 12-year-old Artur in Poland, this was an amazing thing. The website was a fan page, had pictures and information about the band, and it was absolutely glorious. And after that, I was able to access a lot of information, learn about technology, learn languages, form relationships, collaborate with people, and this was all thanks to the web. And of course, that was in the mid-90s. At that point, we still had other protocols that were very frequently used. We had IRC, we had Usenet, we used desktop software for email. But over time, the web has kind of subsumed these ecosystems, and now a lot of what we do, even if we use these other protocols, it's via web UIs. And that's my first reason for being really interested in the web and wanting to work on web security, because I just have a personal attachment, a personal connection to the web. The second reason for giving this talk and for doing this work is much more pragmatic. I've been at Google for close to 10 years, and for about half of that, I have been a TL and sort of cat herder for a small team which got a fairly broad remit from our management to pursue proactive engineering work that can address broader classes of security problems across Google. And Google is arguably the largest web application ecosystem in the world. We have thousands of applications, both user-facing, for publicly user-facing, and internal for Googlers. Google acquires a lot of companies with their own infrastructure. And unlike in some other companies, these infrastructures and these frameworks that we use to create our web applications are very diverse. There is no one single stack that we can create that will abstract the web away. So we are very closely tied to the web ecosystem, and web security problems, web platform security problems, quickly become actual security problems in many Google applications. So with that, I'd like to turn to trying to maybe evaluate or understand a little more where these problems are coming from. And something that I would like to make an argument for is that the current security problems that we've had, and by current I mean over the past decade or past 2 decades even, many of the problems that we have with the web as an application platform stem from the fact that the web wasn't designed as an application platform, right? Initially, it was supposed to be a mesh of interconnected documents that could cross-link with each other. There would be hyperlinks, and they would help you find information and go from one place with interesting information to another. And what it has morphed into organically over close to 30 years is an application ecosystem where you use your bank website and your webmail client and your social network and so on in a way that the original creators of the web, I don't think, ever imagined. So now we have millions of applications. There are trillions of dollars of market cap that are kind of dependent on the web, and the amount of data is hard to grasp. And what is interesting is that in the change from the original vision of the web to what it has currently become, we've had certain epochs, certain eras that I don't want to create this. I didn't want to create a timeline. I like history a lot. I know I couldn't do it justice, but I think we can all agree that there were multiple periods in the development of the web with slightly different areas of focus, with slightly new APIs that were created to address the needs that developers had. And of course, the dancing hamster era is my favorite, but there were many others. And the other interesting thing about the web is that these APIs generally don't go away, right? So, for example, cookies and the same origin policy that were introduced in the mid-90s, let's say during the e-commerce boom, like we still use them and depend on them to this day, right? It's not as if we deprecate those mechanisms and replace them with something better. We are kind of stuck with the decisions that we have made almost a quarter century ago. And the requirements, the security requirements that we have right now of our applications and the world around us is very different from what it was back then. And when I talk about security problems, I want to make clear that it's not security problems with the concept of a mesh of hyperlinked documents. It's problems with the web being an application platform, right? A framework of services that as a developer you can use to build your application. So, and I want to disambiguate a couple of terms. So the web platform is essentially the implementation of an application platform with web technologies, with markup, style sheets, scripting, and the APIs that are available from these mechanisms. And one other thing is I will talk a little bit about web bugs in this presentation. And in some academic resources, web bugs means trackers. Here I will use it as in the literal sense of vulnerabilities that are exploitable against users who are logged into a given application by an external attacker somewhere on the internet. So what I wanted to focus in, and this is kind of the agenda for the next 30 minutes or so, is I want to talk about 3 major problems or things that we should be thinking about to improve web security and also improve web privacy. The first one that is probably the majority of this talk is the kinds of vulnerabilities that arise in web applications that are caused by some of the decisions that we made a long time ago, which were perfectly reasonable then, but in time they turned out to maybe not be great. Then we'll talk a little bit about problems with some of the legacy behaviors we have on the web, and also devote some attention to how we can prevent repeating similar mistakes in the future. And something that is very important is that there are a bunch of ideas in this talk that were proposed by web security researchers, by browser vendors, by people who work in this space and actively make web security and web privacy better. Of course, the fact, if your name is on the slide, it doesn't imply endorsement of what I'll be talking about, but I just wanted to recognize that there are a lot of people who are improving the ecosystem. And primarily, a colleague of mine working on Chrome web platform security, Mike West, who is one of the chairs of the W3C Web AppSec working group, is a person who has proposed and implemented and evangelized many of the upcoming security features that are so critical for improving web security. All right, so why talk about the insecurity of individual web applications? The main reason for this is that if an application platform makes bad security decisions, then this often manifests as individual vulnerabilities in the software that is using this application platform. And the good thing about this, the good thing is that we do have a lot of data about individual vulnerabilities from vulnerability reward programs and from bug bounty programs that have become popular over the last 8.5 years. So the data that I'll present in a moment comes from the Google Web VRP. We pay roughly about $1 million per year for vulnerabilities across our applications. Google also has some other reward programs, for example, for Chrome and the Android OS, but the bulk of what we pay out for are vulnerabilities in individual applications. The Google VRP includes both web applications, but also Android apps, hardware, Google-developed Chrome extensions, and essentially anything that you as a user, as a consumer, might interact with. So what are the kinds of vulnerabilities that we see across Google? So this is a summary of the data of the reward amounts that we have paid out last year for all the vulnerabilities that were reported to us under the Google VRP. And if you look to the left side of the chart, you can see that many of these vulnerabilities were not web-related, right? They are misconfigurations, they are Android and iOS application vulnerabilities, and so on. Some business logic issues where server-side code might, for example, improperly verify authorization, and so on. But at the other side of the pie chart, you'll see that the majority of the rewards that we pay out are for endemic web vulnerabilities, such as cross-site scripting and some other ones. And this is a trend that has been, that we have seen over the past decade very consistently. In the past, we've had an even larger share of web vulnerabilities. I think it was about 70 or 80% a few years ago. Now we're down to just over 50%. But that also means that addressing these vulnerabilities will hugely improve the security of the overall Google application ecosystem. And of course, this pie chart is conflating a few things because the reward amounts are not, it's not the same as counting by the number of individual vulnerabilities, but if I plotted the number of individual vulnerabilities, it would be very similar. So no matter how you slice and dice it, web bugs are kind of the bulk or the majority of what we see at Google. And this is not just Google, because if you look at data that was reported by our friends at Mozilla a couple years ago, for them also cross-site scripting and these endemic web bugs are a fairly frequent occurrence. And we also now have bug bounty vendors, companies that help other companies set up bug bounty programs, and they report some information about the classes of issues they see across entire industries. And I'll just zoom in a little bit on the most common ones, and you'll also see that these web bugs, such as XSS, CSRF, and other ones that you are familiar with, are some of the most popular, most frequently happening issues across pretty much most other companies. And we could talk about these individual vulnerabilities, how they arise, what the patterns are that led to the creation of a vulnerability. But instead of doing that, let's focus maybe on some of the underlying themes, some of the sins, so to speak, of the web as an application development platform. And the first one that is probably obvious in hindsight is the fact that the web relies on mixing code and data, right? You can have data in markup, any label or string, and the next thing that you can have in your markup after that is a script, and that script will execute. So if you're a developer and you're building a web application, you might do some very simple things, such as maybe you, on the server side, you generate a response and you include the user's name, or you do that same thing using inner HTML, which is a native JavaScript API, or maybe you use a higher level library such as jQuery, and you populate part of the page with the user's name. So those are very simple things that we do very frequently as web developers. Or maybe you want to link to the homepage of a user in markup or via a JavaScript API, or just export some data as a file that might contain user-controlled contents. And those are all really simple things. And of course, if you've, I'm pretty sure that everyone in this room recognize that these are, in fact, not safe patterns, right? These very simple things that, as a beginning web developer, you are very likely to do, result in a cross-site scripting vulnerability, because if any of the data that used in these calls is user-controlled, then the attacker can inject a script via one of many different ways, and execute scripts in the context of the vulnerable application. And there are two huge problems with this. The first one is that, as I mentioned, these patterns are extremely common. As a naive developer, you will make dozens of these mistakes while building a fairly simple web application. The second problem is the impact of cross-site scripting. So, and the impact is that once you have any of these patterns, any of these bugs, anywhere in your web origin, in your application, an attacker can execute arbitrary JavaScript as the logged-in user in your application and steal and modify all of the data, potentially backdoor the data that you have in the application. So it's as if every time you got a cold, you died, right? Because this is both very frequent and also very, very damaging. All right, so let's talk about another pattern, and this is something that is that is slightly maybe less common than cross-site scripting, but also happens a lot in web applications. The problem here is that web applications don't really restrict the attack surface. So we'll see what I mean in just a moment. But let's look at some patterns first. So let's say that your application just has a simple form that you can use to transfer money to another person. So in here, I would send $10 to Dev in the top example. Or the second example, there's just a button that does something sensitive like deleting an account. Or we generate a little bit of JavaScript with authenticated user data that's interpolated. Or we make an extra call to the database before returning a response to the user. Those are all very frequent patterns again, but all of them result in vulnerabilities, in exploitable web application vulnerabilities. So the first example is cross-site request forgery. The second one, where an attacker can invoke the same form from an attacking page and arbitrarily change the amounts in the form. And the server will have no way of telling apart same origin, a form that was submitted from the same origin from an attacker-submitted form. The second one is clickjacking, where an attacker can just iframe our page, and when the victim clicks anywhere on the attacker's site, they will delete the account on our victim site. The third example is cross-site script inclusion, where any data that is parsable as JavaScript can be included by the attacker's website in no course mode, and the attacker gets access to that data. And finally, the last one is timing attacks. The attacker can send requests to cross-origin endpoints, and based on the amount of time it took the server to respond, the attacker can infer whether there was a search result that was found for a given query or not. And those are very different kinds of vulnerabilities, and usually we think about them individually, right? Cross-site request forgery is very different than timing attacks. But what they have in common is that they are caused by the same underlying pattern on the web, and that pattern is twofold. The first one is that every endpoint can be identified by a URL, right? So every action that we take in a web application usually sends a request to some server-side endpoint, some servlet, and the server responds with some data. The second part of the problem is that these requests, even if they are made by a third-party cross-origin attacking site, will reach your server with all the authentication cookies that you have for the vulnerable web application. And this, we have the same origin policy, which prevents direct interactions with cross-origin applications, but this is still something that undermines some of the isolation properties that we would ideally like to have in an application platform. All right, so let's move to the last one, and this is probably the happiest story. So the problem originally that we had on the web was that everything was sent over HTTP. So if you look at the default Apache documentation, it'll tell you to serve your site on port 80, or if you create a cookie, that cookie will be available to both secure origins to HTTPS and HTTP, right? So if you do this, if you just create a new site, odds are it will be a site served over an insecure channel. And this has been the case for a long time. Luckily, this is a pattern that's very easy to spot. So if you are building a new web application, you will recognize that, oh, this is HTTP, it's a sensitive application, I should probably move to HTTPS. So because this is easy to identify and also automatically detect, it's a happier story than the other patterns. And of course, these are some of the underlying problems of the web. But there are other issues, right? Many of the APIs that developers use to build their applications have unsafe defaults. So as an example, if you use post message to receive messages from your application, by default, unless you make an explicit check for the source of the message, you'll have a vulnerability, and any attacker-controlled origin will be able to spoof a message to your application. There's no defense in depth, and there are many APIs that are difficult to use. And it's very difficult to create security configuration and enforce security configuration for your entire app. Usually there's some response header that you have to set on every response from your application, and that gets difficult to enforce in practice. So the question is, it's kind of terrible, right? And how is it possible that in 2019, with all the underlying unsafety, the web is such a popular, potentially even dominant application ecosystem? And the answer to this is that we have been doing very well on pushing the responsibility for this unsafety onto individual application developers. So if you have a cross-site scripting bug or a cross-site request forgery bug or any of the other ones, well, it's kind of your fault because you should have read up on web security and you should have escaped all the data and so on and so on. So we blame the developer. And we also have some things that alleviate the problem. So we can find vulnerabilities by using bug bounties and code reviews. We have automated scanners that alert us to some issues, and so on. Finally, the probably most frequent way to avoid these problems, especially for big companies that have resources for this, is to build layers of abstraction over the web that prevent developers from using native unsafe APIs, and instead they are forced to use, let's say, a wrapper over inner HTML that will automatically HTML escape all the data. But for that, you need to create a lot of infrastructure to prevent developers from using the unsafe native APIs. And because there is no central security authority for the web, it's easy for everyone to point in another direction, saying, well, it's the developer, or it's the browser vendor, it's the lack of guidance from the W3C, and so on. So, and this makes it easy to not solve the problem. But The good thing is that we are getting very close to having a set of APIs, set of security mechanisms that address some of these problems. And it's the first time in the history of the web that we have this. And to think about how we can do this more broadly, let's look at the example of how the switch to HTTPS happened. And I will not repeat everything that Emily said a couple of years ago, but in order to get the web to move from HTTP to HTTPS, there were two things that needed to happen. First, browser vendors needed to adopt security mechanisms that let developers easily move to HTTPS. And that includes HSTS, some features in CSP, options for cookies, and so on. And the second element of this was it had to be easy for developers to create certificates. We kind of had to shame some websites and directly work with them and tell them, hey, your site, your news site, for example, doesn't have HTTPS, and it really should. And there were many other efforts. So, and this resulted over a few years in a very large increase in the amount of HTTPS traffic on the web. So the question is whether we can use a similar strategy for some of the underlying web platform security problems. And this is, I will not have time to go into the details of these APIs, but based on our experience at Google and in adding these security mechanisms to hundreds of applications, there are a couple of things that I think will be the future of web security that will that allow developers to address injections. The first part of this is to make server-side responses safe by requiring a nonce-based CSP policy that will enforce that every script that is present in markup has the right crypto token that matches what is in an HTTP response header. And the browser, because this is a feature that is enforced by the browser will immediately stop the execution of any script that does not have the correct nonce attribute. The second part of the equation is a new API called trusted types, and this is something that makes DOM programming, so JavaScript programming, safe by default. And this is modeled on a Google internal layer of abstraction over web APIs. And the way it works is when you enable trusted types in your application, then all string assignments to dangerous APIs just error out. So you can no longer assign a string to inner HTML. In order to use one of the unsafe web APIs, you need to create a trusted type object, for example, a trusted HTML or trusted script URL. And your attack surface for your JavaScript code shifts from your entire application, all of your JavaScript, to just the policy that creates these types. There are some links. I'll share the slides if you're interested in the details. We can do something similar for isolation, to restrict the attack surface of individual applications. And the way we can do this is there are several mechanisms that kind of overlap and mesh together to give more isolation guarantees that we've had before. So a mechanism that I like a lot is called fetch metadata request headers, and that is something that annotates every HTTP request with some information about where that request is coming from. So based on these values, the server can accept or reject a request based on some security criteria. And there are other complementary security mechanisms such as the cross-origin resource policy, same-site cookies, cross-origin opener policy. It's a super exciting area that we sadly don't have time to go into. I'll just share one example of how you could use fetch metadata request headers to protect from, for example, cross-site request forgery, timing attacks, and other issues. Essentially, you can have middleware in your site that will only allow requests with trusted segfetch site and segfetch mode values. All right. So long story short, what we need to do to help developers write secure web applications is first we have to create the security mechanisms that they can use to protect their web applications. And we have to help developers adopt them. We have to write documentation, integrate with browser tools, the Mozilla Observatory, and other header scanners. And then something that will be very important in the long term is to figure out how we can enable this by default for the whole web. And Ideally, we'll be able to get there. If we cannot get there, and some of these require, let's say, invasive changes to web applications that are not backwards compatible, right? They make developers do work. And if we cannot deploy them across the whole web, then we should at least think about how we can enforce them for the sensitive applications that users are using. So, maybe it's an unrealistic goal to have content security policy adopted across 100% of websites, including my blog, to which no one logs into. But if you have, let's say, a webmail client or a site where the user logs in or has sensitive data, maybe those are the ones where browsers need to enforce the presence of these features. And this is a very open question, very open research area, and we definitely need more people thinking about this. All right, so let's say we do this. This will be a lot of work for browser vendors. Will we be done? And the answer is not yet, right? There are still legacy web features that, even if your application doesn't have obvious vulnerabilities, allow attackers to infer some information about the user and compromise some security or privacy guarantees. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that browsers have a lot of global state, and the boundaries between different applications are kind of imperfect. And I'll share a few examples here. And my favorite one, which is probably not, definitely not the worst problem for the web, but something that I enjoy thinking about, is history detection. So if you're not familiar with the feature, in CSS, you can style visited links differently from unvisited ones. So you can give them different colors. But then JavaScript lets you read the color of a given link, and based on this, a malicious site could quickly create, I think we checked, it was about 20 to 30,000 links per second, and determine whether a user visited these URLs. There was a very creative and very smart fix proposed and implemented in all browsers by David Barron at Mozilla, and the solution to this was for the browser to lie to JavaScript, to the developer, about the color of the link, so that even if you check, so that even if a link is blue, the browser would say red, or the other way around. And there are also some other changes that had to be made to make the color of the link undetectable from a script. All right, so it seems like this would help. But since then, and that happened, I think, in 2011, there has been a body of very interesting attacks that undermine some benefits of this solution. So there are definitely timing attacks. So if you have a link and you change the URL and that ends up changing the color of the link, in many ways you can, even though you cannot directly read the color of the link, the amount of time that this will take will be longer or shorter, depending on various factors. You can have 10,000 links pointing to the same URL on the same page. It's a very difficult boundary for a browser vendor to uphold. Another very cute set of attacks is attacks based on user interaction. So the developer, the attacker, cannot know the color of the link, but the user will still see the link styled with a different color. So the top example is you can make a 7-segment display that will show a different character based on whether a user visited a certain website or set of websites. And if the user tells you, for example, if you pretend it's a CAPTCHA and you have several of these characters, you as the attacker can learn what the user actually saw, which will tell the attacker what the visited links were. And Michael Zalewski created a very interesting asteroids game where the links that you visited are in the form of asteroids that might hit your ship, and then you have to click on them to remove them, and based on where the user clicked, the attacker knows which websites you visited. And it has lots of other smart ideas to increase kind of the bandwidth of that leak. Another side channel that I also think was fairly acute was some browsers enabled the ambient light sensor. This is just something that tells you how much light enters the sensor that you have on the front of your smartphone usually. And the thing is, if your screen is white, you will get a different reading from the ambient light sensor if there's any reflective surface, let's say about 1 or 2 feet above your phone. So you can distinguish whether the screen is black or whether it's white, you can make a link that will take the whole screen, and based on the reading from the ambient light sensor, you will be able to know whether a link is visited. And you can do this fairly quickly. I think it's more of a curiosity than an actual attack, but this is the class of things that we have to deal with if we support visited link styling. All right, another class of attacks that we've had for a long time in most browsers is cache detection. Ed Felten and Michael Schneider wrote a seminal paper about 20 years ago. And by the way, the history attack also is almost 20 years old. The paper on web timings is you can check whether a resource is in the browser cache. And based on that, know whether a user visited a certain website. This works. I think Safari is the only browser that has implemented protections against this. Other browsers have not yet, but there's some movement in Chrome. And the problem with this class of attacks is since the original attack was proposed, the techniques to learn whether something was in the cache have gotten better. You can do it without polluting the cache because you can clear a given URL with very creative tricks that our team loves to investigate. So you get a much more reliable detector of whether something is in the cache. And also there are new attacks that have come up over the past few years, such as cross-site search, where if a search results page has a cacheable resource, then a malicious attacker can point the user to a page with a given search term. And if after the visit to that page, the cached resource has been cached, then you know that there were some results, that the search query returned some results for the user. And if not, then you know that there was no result. And that lets you leak, for example, the contents of emails. Another more recent attack proposed by my colleague Steffen Rittger was the browser has, pretty much each browser has a global connection pool that is shared across all the tabs, all the sites that are open in the web browser. And if you exhaust all of them and just release one, and then see as the attacker whether you can, what the timing is of a connection to your own server, you can perform timing of individual resource loads on any website. So you use up all the connections, then you open a new site, and then you get for each resource that's on a separate connection, you get information about how long it took, and that allows very interesting timing attacks. Another set of attacks that we have seen over the past decade, including possibly you have heard of the Zoom remote code execution and remote camera attack from a couple of weeks ago. It's based on the fact that the browser can send requests to internal RFC 1918 addresses, which means that if you have a server listening on localhost or your local or your router or your printer, a user that visits an attacker's site will send requests to their local network devices from their browser, which can lead to terrible things. And in addition to that, so those are kind of the big problems that we've had. I think pretty much every person working on the web has their own laundry list of problems that they would like to fix. We have APIs that are bad that we should really kill. There are issues that leak information that we really wouldn't want to leak. There's lots of things to discuss here. We have to start fixing all of them slowly, and we can use what Chrome has done, and other browser vendors too, has done with some efforts to deprecate unsafe patterns on the web, like removing Flash slowly and thoughtfully, but kind of forcefully, and also removing access to powerful APIs such as geolocation on HTTP pages. So it makes developers unhappy sometimes, but this is something we have to do to improve the health of the ecosystem. So, to solve this class of problems, we need to solve the large problems individually, but then also figure out what to do with these quirky APIs. And this is another one of those research areas where we have to understand the trade-offs and the compatibility risks of removing each individual API. And we don't have great data to understand how much will break, what the impact will be for developers and users. So more attention to these areas is very important. All right, so I have about 5 minutes to talk about some attacks that would otherwise take about an hour to properly describe. So I'll be very quick. The thing that I will summarize, before getting into the details, something that is not very appreciated is that any time that there's a new API that launches on the web, that immediately changes the security posture of every existing web application. Some of these new APIs, even if they are not used by a given site, by your bank, by your webmail, these APIs can be used by the attacker to potentially leak some data from your site, right? So we have to be very careful when adding new APIs to the web platform and ensure that they do not allow information leaks. So you might think, oh, those are these scary APIs like camera access or payment request and so on. But actually, these are usually not what I would be worried about because they require user consent. There's a permission prompt. The user will decide, oh, I do want to allow evil.com to use my microphone or not. And we can kind of hope that users will make, of course, we know that users don't make great security decisions, but at least there's an explicit user action that has to happen. What I am worried more about are APIs that don't require any interaction from the user to enable them. So, and I'll give a few examples. So a couple of years ago at Black Hat, some researchers published a very interesting and damaging attack called HEIST, which relied in the kind of, if you boil it down to one tiny feature that enabled this attack, it was the fact that the fetch API returns a promise that resolves the moment the first byte of the response is downloaded. What was the case before is that you could measure the timing of the entire resource load, so when the resource was fully downloaded, but not when it started to be, when you got the first byte. So this seems like a really tiny security delta, right? Like what's the problem? Since we already exposed the load time of the whole resource, what's the problem with disclosing the time when the first byte arrives? And the problem here is that the attacker can infer whether the entire resource fits in one TCP window size, which usually is about 14.5 kilobytes. And this also doesn't seem terrible, right? Like, so what's the big deal if the attacker knows if a given cross-origin response was less than or bigger than 14.5 kilobytes. But there are very interesting ways in which that can be abused to, as the researchers demonstrated, steal credit card numbers from your email, for example. Another attack that I'm worried to get into in the next couple of minutes is Spectre, and we will not discuss Spectre at all. But the feature that enabled accurate attacks, kind of tractable, real-world proofs of concept, was the fact that the shared array buffer, which is a very useful and an API that seemed benign at first, but the fact that shared array buffer allowed nanosecond level timers, and the increase in resolution of a shared array buffer based timer over explicit timing APIs like window performance now was enough to make attacks feasible where they were difficult to execute before. And of course, both of these issues, HEIST and Spectre, were not caused by the fact that that the promise resolves immediately or that there's a more accurate timing API. But these were kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, right? Those were incremental small changes that didn't seem like they would cause security problems, but in aggregate, because of other side channels, they ended up allowing reliable exploits. Another, and this is the last feature that I will talk about, that is kind of interesting, that it is a different class of API that also leads to security problems, was a feature that was proposed by Chrome developers that actually ended up not shipping because of the security concerns. So if you're familiar with URL fragments, they are something that allows you to scroll to a given part of your web page. For example, if you have an element with a given ID or name, the URL fragment will let you scroll on a navigation exactly to that element. So the proposal was to extend this, to make this more powerful, and in addition to scrolling to a given ID or name attribute, to allow scrolling to an arbitrary CSS selector. And this is a great feature. From a developer's point of view, we really want to be able to scroll to elements that don't have a name or ID, and it's kind of powerful. But the problem is that if there is an attacker-controlled iframe on the page, an attacker can create a complex CSS selector and query the contents of an HTML attribute anywhere on the page, and using intersection observer, see if the iframe that the attacker controls on the vulnerable page was scrolled to, and based on that, leak information. And an attacker could repeat it many times and steal arbitrary secrets from your page. And thanks to some of the consulting that happened after the feature was proposed, it changed shape to something that is much safer in the end. So we have the potential to make mistakes as we evolve the web platform. And there are two things that we can do to minimize the security impact of these mistakes. The first one is we should pay more attention to new web APIs that are being proposed. And we can create more secure restrictive modes so that even if there is that would restrict pages that need or want access to these powerful APIs. And if we do this, for example, if we make sure that if a page has access to a powerful, scary API, every resource loaded by this page is a resource that opted into being loaded, then even if some of these APIs end up leaking information, they could only leak information from cooperating resources. The problem with this is that this slows down feature development, and that can make browser developers and application developers unhappy. All right, so this is my last slide, and I think there is a lot to unpack. The web has been around for several decades, and I think we are close to changing it into a platform that is actually much safer than it was ever before. But to get there, we need to do three things. First, we need to implement these security mechanisms. We need to implement them across all browsers, and we need to evangelize these security mechanisms to web developers. We need to really think about which legacy web features we want to keep in the platform and which we can remove. And finally, we should really pay attention to new web platform features and help browser vendors ship them safely. And if we cannot, we should help them figure out alternatives. All right, thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Please state your name and affiliation before you ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, Ari Trachtenberg, Boston University. Great talk. I like the talk. But I'm a little confused. It seems like what you're saying is the way we need to fix the web is by adding more complexity and more attacker surface area, and then you proceeded to explain why that's a bad idea. Is this really going to solve the problem, or are we just going to add more problems that we don't understand?
So this is a very legitimate, good question. I would separate features, security features, from other web platform features, right? The features that we need are 3 or 4 mechanisms that allow you to add restrictions to your website to protect it from certain classes of attacks. That is in contrast to dozens or hundreds of new APIs that add new functionality to the platform. So I would say that the cost of adding this security complexity to the web platform is justified, right? Because it's a tiny amount of work compared to all the other adoption of features that happens in the platform that has a very measurable security impact. But of course, there could be security features that seem useful but end up not protecting against the vulnerabilities that they thought they would protect. And I would say CSP in its original form is one of those, which is super complex and everyone gets it wrong. So, and the only thing I can say to this is that we should think more and create better security features. But this is, I know it's kind of hand-wavy. We should just be smarter than we were in the past.
Hi there, Artur. My name is John Willender. I'm from the Apple WebKit team. This subject, of course, is super important. Thank you for a great talk. So getting the web to this better place could be done through carrots, sticks, or both. And I know we've tried some carrots where we'd said you can only get access to these new APIs that you want if you're a secure context, for instance. And we could push further. We could even say that you need to run a sane CSP. Otherwise, you don't get access to these APIs. But comparing it to native platforms, such as, for instance, iOS or Android, there we have a different way of doing it because we ship SDK, so we ship the platform with the APIs, and we can do special stuff saying that when you compile the next time, you can no longer use these APIs. And we don't have that. It's referred to by us as linked on or after checks. So we can say the next version of iOS, you can no longer do this thing. We've removed or deprecated or obsoleted this thing. And we don't really have that on the web. Say we could come up with it, meaning is it worthwhile hunting down such a thing? Do you believe we could do such a thing too? Not only carrots saying, hey, you get access to APIs, you're secure, but also the next time you change your website, you can no longer use this API.
I think, yes, this is a great idea, and we should do this. We haven't done this a lot, but the success that Chrome has had with, for example, pushing not secure as the indicator that you see in the address bar shows that we can do this. And we can do this kind of subtly just by saying, oh, this website is not secure. And we can start breaking access to some APIs in ways that, we don't want to cause web-wide breakage, but I think we should cause more breakage than we have before because it's a good trade-off. We should talk more about this in the future, too. I'm not sure if we have time for one more question.
Yeah, we can take one more question, and then the rest we'll have to take offline.
Sorry, guys.
Go ahead.
Ben Stock from CISPA. Excellent talk. Thank you. One thing that I was thinking about, so trusted types in particular. It sounds like a nice idea, but let's say that I'm a developer at company X, and my goals for this year is to implement trusted types. What I will do is I will create a default policy, which takes a string and creates a safe HTML type out of this. Do you think there's some way in which you could somehow punish this or make this infeasible? Because right now it seems like if there's a security mechanism, the developer will find a functional way around the security mechanism and break the security mechanism.
It's definitely possible to have trusted types and still have security vulnerabilities, right? This is it's a programmatic API, not a declarative one. We cannot protect developers from shooting themselves in the foot. I would argue that just the fact that you're reducing the attack surface from all of your JavaScript to this potentially one function is a qualitative improvement in security. And you can still obviously mess up that one function. But maybe then it will be more tractable to build static analysis, do dynamic analysis on these functions, or build services that will tell you, oh, this one function is safe, therefore you don't have DOM XSS. But I completely agree, there will still be DOM XSS even if you have trusted types if you mess up there. But we should think about how we can reduce the likelihood that it will happen. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Artur.